So getting back into the data, we looked at how young and how new are a lot of these pre-roll businesses. So right off the bat, you can see that almost 40% of pre-roll businesses are brand new. So this is like 1 to 2 years old. And then on top of that, another over 30% are just 2 to 3 years old. So almost 70% or over 70% of all pre-roll businesses are relatively young, under 3 years old. And this is for a number of reasons. One, the cannabis industry is very new, so there's going to be a lot of new companies getting into it. Most companies start off by just growing flower, and then once they realize they have a lot of flower, they need more products to make with it. The first thing they do is start making pre-rolls. And then at first, pre-rolls weren't that glamorous. People were just putting trim and shake into it. But now that it's less of an afterthought and pre-rolls are catching on in popularity, multi-packs are getting more popular, brands are starting to realize that they need to get involved. It helps get their brand out to more consumers. They could just buy one single pre-roll, get to know their brand and those strains better. So the overall pre-roll market is growing and relatively young. Another reason, that we see brands are relatively young and new is that the startup costs are very accessible as a new company just starting out. So compared to extraction, where you should be prepared to pay tens of thousands, if not over $100,000 to get all the equipment you need, you could get started with pre-rolls in your kitchen table. You could buy a box of cones and hand fill them. You'd be surprised how many brands are still hand packing pre-rolls. But even getting a basic industrial cone packing machine, which we have in this picture, King Cone, costs $1,800, and then an industrial cannabis grinder of $2,500, under $5,000, and you could be making thousands of pre-rolls a day with a 1 to 2 person team. And then in terms of expansion, we interviewed those over 300 businesses, and over 95% had plans to expand. So that shows us that their business is doing well, consumers are responding to the product and the brand that they're putting out there, and so we expect huge growth in pre-rolls and the industry as a whole going forward. And some of these new things that brands are expanding into are some trends that we spotted, which are infused pre-rolls, which made up only 12.7% just a few years ago, and then most recently over 32%. So infused pre-rolls are essentially a regular pre-roll that's infused with cannabis oil one way or another. The most common way is by painting a layer of oil on the outside of the pre-roll and then rolling it into keef, which is the trichromes that get extracted from the flower. That makes it really potent, really flavorful. And some other ways people infuse them is by actually taking oil and mixing it in with the flour and then packing it into the cone so you wouldn't really see it from the outside. But if you looked at the potency percentage, those pre-rolls are testing more around 50%, whereas a typical pre-roll would be 15 to 20% potency. So like I mentioned, the main way people are making pre-rolls now is a very manual process. There hasn't been a lot of technology for this since the industry is so new. There wouldn't have been a need for an infused pre-roll machine just a couple years ago. But recently we're seeing some automated technology come to the space, which is really exciting. So the machine on the right is an automated infusing machine, which will take your finished pre-rolls, so you can make them with by hand, an automated machine, any way, doesn't matter. You load it into a cartridge, and then a needle injects a rod of oil specifically where you want. So you could program the machine to take a 10-millimeter gap from the filter up and then inject like a 30-millimeter rod of oil exactly where you want it. And another benefit of infusing it this way is that oil is a combustible. So if you've ever lit an infused pre-roll or burnt some oil off of some of your dab tools, you'll see a thick black smoke come off of it. You really shouldn't be smoking oil that way. When it's infused right in the middle, the ember at the end of the pre-roll starts vaporizing the oil before it gets to it and creates a much more smoother, better tasting smoking experience, and that helps prevent runs as well. So getting back into the data, we looked at what size pre-rolls brands were producing. So as I mentioned, when the market first gets started, 1 gram pre-rolls dominate. It's the easiest, most popular format right now. But half grams and smaller sizes are getting more and more popular. And this also helps, or the price of cannabis coming down, the wholesale costs, the growing costs, the economy scales of people that they're realizing, helps get the average cost of cannabis down, and that makes it more conducive to have multi-packs, where you have 3, 4, 10, 12, even 28 pre-rolls in a multi-pack. And then you could see what are the sizes of the multi-packs that are getting more popular. So the 1-pack still dominates, makes over 50% of the market, but you'll see more and more 2 and 3 packs, 4 and 5 packs, and like I mentioned, even up to 28 packs, which is typically 28 1-gram pre-rolls, which is 1 ounce. That's the state limit in a lot of places for what you could buy in a retail store. Then when you look at the packaging that people are putting it into, the standard was the dupe tube. It's the single pop-top plastic tube. But as you know, a lot of consumers have hesitancy about that single-use plastic. They care more about the environment as well as what their brand looks like. The cannabis space is getting more and more competitive. You need to stand out. So just having a plastic tube with a label isn't enough for a lot of brands to penetrate the market. So you'll see a lot of glass tubes, especially for pre-rolls. Those are very popular. And then in the multi-packs, there's plastic, there's tin, there's different options there that are child resistant, non-child resistant, like cigarette boxes. Tins can both be child resistant or non-child resistant. And so a ton of variety into the packaging space, which plays into your overall brand and your marketing. And then last, just looking at some of the top brands, obviously California is going to continue to dominate. The biggest brands out there are Sublime, Jeter, and Lowell. But some reassuring data is when we interview customers from other states, they aren't necessarily familiar with these brands. So you shouldn't have the mindset of, oh, I'm not in California, my brand's never going to compete. People really don't care and they don't know. It's more about the quality of the flower. And if you're not in the cool state like California, people outside the state hardly know of these brands. And I'm sure there's plenty of consumers even within the California market that aren't familiar with a lot of these brands, because these larger brands aren't like authentic and grassroots. We see the cannabis industry evolving much like the craft beer or wine industry, where there's a ton of different options, ton of different brands, and people actually favor those smaller craft growers that are going to have higher quality, more unique packaging, and a closer connection to their consumer.